So welcome all, and thank you for coming. I realized that I neglected something on my first lecture, and that was to introduce my wife, who's really, Lynn Osborne. She's really responsible for making sure the overheads, the PowerPoints, look good, because she comes out of advertising, and so she knows how to do that much better than us ex-academics, that's for sure. Anyway, thank you for coming. This is a very interesting thing that I don't know about if you do, but I never really knew all of this until I started researching it. But the Vikings have had an amazing influence on Western civilization, our language, English, which I'll talk about, our genetics, because you're all going to be surprised by the percentage of Viking genes that you probably are carrying already, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like it's a fascinating study back in history, and we're going to travel in the footsteps of the Vikings. So anyway, let me go forward and. This is just the background that we covered in my first presentation, just in case you're not really aware. I have both a PhD and a law degree from Columbia. The PhD was in European history, and I started to teach there, and then I said, whoa, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to do the same thing for the rest of my life. And so I went to law school, became a Wall Street lawyer, and then a corporate lawyer after that, totally. And so as a result, the background, I did a lot of international work as a lawyer. And in fact, I had an office in Brussels and in D.C., so I was traveling extensively for a long time. And hopefully that helps me with all these presentations. So here, let's talk about the Vikings. And then first, the term Viking. The term Viking comes from a pirate, it used to be a pirate, who lived in a cove or a fjord. And in Viking languages and the Norse language, a fjord or part of a river is called a vik, V-I-K. And so that's where you get the word Viking. And so it's just quite clear how we got that name. But they also are known by many other names. By the French, the French, team in the Middle Ages, they called them, the Vikings, the Northmen. And the Danes would call, or the Anglo-Saxons would call the Vikings Danes, because most of them came from Denmark. And in Eastern Europe, they were known by the name Rus, which is a Finnish word for oat. Oarsmen, sorry. And ultimately, if you think about it, Rus, where do you see that today? Russia. The name Russia comes from the Vikings, because the first ruler of Russia areas was Rurik, who was a Viking. So anyway, that's the word Viking, where it comes from, and you probably are somewhat familiar with some of the history of it. Vikings seem to have done and been everywhere in Northern Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the Byzantine Empire, and even in the Middle East, because they were used to selling slaves to the Middle East, to the Islamic countries. They were extremely resourceful. And when Vikings found wealth and weak political structure, that's when they raided. When they found strong leaders seeking soldiers, they served. When they found empty land, they would assume it and farm. And when they found trade routes, they traded. Really resourceful people. They had their fingers in so many pies, you wouldn't believe it. Anyway, they took great voyages to trade for a lot of things. One of them was metals, because they had few sources of metals at home. And in particular, once bronze was uncovered, that bronze was an alloy of copper and tin, they really searched around the world for sources of tin, sources of copper, because what would a Viking be without a bronze sword or axe. He needed that. That was his claim to fame, if you wish. And also they were looking for iron to make farming implements, to say the least. So they were very active in trade. They did get timber too. They had forests up in Scandinavia, which they could use to construct homes, fences, and use it for fire for cooking and heating. But basically they needed metals, and they didn't have metals in Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia is the home of the Vikings, and this is a decent map of it. And they were really cut off from Central Europe by the sea and also dense forests, to say the least. And so they were never a part of the Roman Empire, which most of the rest of us have a lot of history from that. Being cut off is one reason why they focused on travel by water, because it was the fastest means of travel. And they were looking for markets for foreign products, and they did have things to trade. They had animal skins, they had ivory, they did have some things to trade. The Roman Empire demand for goods was immense. It was enormous. The Danes were able to sell food and labor to the Roman army on the Rhine River. And archaeology has now uncovered in burial sites, Viking burial sites, a tremendous amount of Roman goods, Roman glass, Roman weapons, etc. So they really had a very good history of trade with the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire never conquered them, Now, they were pastoral people originally, with sheep, cattle, horses, and goats. They really were. This is something some of us don't really probably realize. They did plant grain. They planted grain for fodder, for bread, and they gathered, eggs and things like that from their chickens. They did fish, they whaled, they hunted, and that made up their food diet. But in the normal highlands of the north, the northern highlands, if you wish, or homelands, there became a population explosion, say the least. And there was a scarcity of farmland. And only the eldest son would inherit from the family. So the others had to go seek land elsewhere. And this is part of the reasons they were expanding all the time or going and traveling all the time. Now, they excelled in shipbuilding. This is some background that you need before we get involved in the real history. They excelled in shipbuilding, and they were able to dominate a lot of seas and rivers. And so what they were able to do, too, in the 6th century, I think, or it was the 8th century, they created a keel to help carry a mast. And they rode the waves. They didn't battle them, so to speak. They also had very low draft boats, which you can see from these two pictures, that could be beached on sandy shores or sail up rivers because they had a shallow draft, so they could go up very shallow rivers, so to speak. Warships of the Vikings could reach a speed of about 12 knots and could carry a crew of about 50 in the 9th century. And by building the ships a little bigger over the course of time, in the 10th and 11th centuries, they had warships that had 100 warriors to 200 warriors on their ships, to say the least. Now, an example of that was in 845, 120 longships, Viking longships, sailed from Denmark to capture Paris. And they covered more than 1,000 miles in less than a month. By comparison, medieval armies on land could travel only about 12 to 15 miles a day. So it's a real contrast. In essence, Vikings had almost a monopoly on sea power during these early Middle Ages. Now, the word keel comes from the Old Norse word, which is kol. And they have a clinker-built ship with side planks overlapping, stitched together. Initially, they rowed, but now they quickly moved into sails with the mast and the rest. They also had a modified paddle, which was called the steerboard, which was mounted on the right-hand side of the ship. That's how they would rudder, etc. And styra is the word in Norse to steer, and the English we've adopted that word steer. I do want to say something, though, for all of us on a cruise. The word starboard is a corruption of the Viking steerboard. Starboard means right-hand side of the ship, and that's how we got that terminology. If you want to be a good cruiser, what do you call the left-hand side of the ship? Port. And so an easy way to remember that is port has 4 letters, left has 4 letters. That's the way I remembered it when I was a kid. And so anyway, just to give you some tricks of the trade, so to speak. Anyway, okay. I think we've got enough information on the weather and the rest, so we could go forward. The Vikings also had an ocean-going cargo ship, the Canar or Nar, which was able to carry about 50 tons. And they could move products much faster and more efficiently than any kind of land transport. And it was easy to carry these ships from one river system to another over land. They would carry them over the land. And they could raid Eastern Europe with these ships and get slaves to sell them elsewhere, primarily into the Islamic world, etc. And the last thing I just want to mention is they did voyage way beyond just Europe. They traveled the whole Atlantic Ocean to new settlements further and further away, first being Iceland, which we will talk about on this lecture, then Greenland. And of course, the final thing is they actually did make it also to Canada. Lanzo-Meadow is the settlement, and they call it Vinland, because they were able to try to grow some grapes, etc. So they really were quite extensive, and that settlement didn't last a long time, unfortunately, but they did make it there, that's for sure. 500 years before Christopher Columbus made it there. Anyway, today we're going to focus on Viking expansion in the British Isles and Iceland. And this map shows where both the Danish Vikings and the Norwegian Vikings raided in the British Isles. The yellow gold lines are the Danish conquests. The pink lines are the Norwegian. And they were mainly settling the Norwegians were mainly settling in the more northern aspects of the British Isles, and including the Orkneys and the Shetlands, and we'll be going to both of those on this cruise. They did schedule their raids, though, too. You have to understand that back home they were actually farming, and so they would raid once they had already planted the seeds at home, and they would return when it was time to harvest the crops. So it was very efficient. The nice thing about going to England was that there were a lot of warring tribes in England, kingdoms in England that were warring with each other, which meant the native people were very busy fighting each other. And so that made the area an easy prey for the Vikings, to say the least. Okay, let's take a quick look. The Viking raids and settlements occurred between 550 and 1100. It's really AD, but the new terminology of historians and archaeologists is CE, meaning the Common Era. Same years, so they haven't changed the dates at all. Anyway, why did these Vikings expand? They were always seeking more profitable trade routes as the old ones decreased in value. But they also had a whole slew of other set of reasons. There was overpopulation, as I mentioned, so that exceeded the agricultural potential of their own homeland. And only the oldest son could inherit, so the youngest sons had to go out and make their fortune elsewhere. And it was really more profitable to seek more land and ag productivity elsewhere then cleared large forests in Scandinavias. And one other thing, which is interesting, the Vikings followed polygamy. And so the Viking males were searching for females, and extra wives, if you wish. So they first attacked the centers of wealth, which were easy, and monasteries proved to be the easiest targets because the monks and the priests did not fight back, obviously. So well before the Vikings arrived, we're going to have to talk a little bit about some of the other tribes that were there. And this is, in Scotland, there were the Picts, P-I-C-T-S. These were an Iron Age people who lived in the northern and southern parts of what is now Scotland, including the Orkneys and the Shetlands, which will be in the next 2 days. And they were there from approximately the 4th century to the 9th century. And originally, the Picts dominated a large part of Scotland without any contests. They were really quite aggressive. The first document, and we'll talk about them in a second more, the first documented raid by the Vikings in the British Isles was by the Danish Vikings at Lindisfarne Abbey in England, and it was 793 CE or AD. They took the monastery's silver, they took their books, they enslaved the monks, they sold many of those monks to others as slaves, and killed any who resisted, for sure. And the chronicles that detail all of this was written by a monk who wrote, "Never before has such an atrocity been seen." And that kind of negativism about them created the negative perception of Vikings that lasted for more than 12 centuries. And we still have it in some ways because they were not paying much attention to the niceties of life when they raided monasteries and killed priests and monks. But, it is a rough age. The Middle Ages was a rough age, and there was violence all over the place. So you have to sort of adjust to understanding that. But, it was not something that we could condone, that's for sure. And this is what's left of the Lindisfarne Monastery today. It's a wonderful ruin, but there's nothing there. As you can see, Lindisfarne is relatively close to Edinburgh, and it's south of Aberdeen, south of us today. And the kingdom of Northumbria, which is shown in gold on the map, experienced only a few periods of real stability after the first Viking raid because the Danish Vikings, kept coming in to their land, attacking monasteries, attacking anything else they could to get money, to get land, whatever. When the Vikings invaded, the original Pict inhabitants of Scotland resisted. And so we had a constant battle between the Picts and the Vikings. The Vikings eventually defeated them, and they did that after 839. And they settled then. The Vikings settled in Shetland. They settled in Orkney. They settled in the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. They began integrating with the local population. And in fact, in 875, King Harold Fairhair of Norway ruled the northern Scottish Isles and the Hebrides and parts of Scotland. The Norwegians now, they were part of the Vikings, of course, were now in control. Here are some examples of Viking settlements and what their houses look like. Pretty straightforward if you've done the history, and you can see. No air conditioning, no heat, whatever. This zoom-in map focuses on where they finally settled, if you wish. And is the map okay? Yeah, okay. Sometimes these maps go bad. They settled. The red areas in the circle show the 9th century Vikings were already settling in eastern England, parts of Scotland, parts of western and northern Scotland, including the Hebrides, the Orkneys and Shetland, as well as the eastern coast of Iceland. The orange shows the expansion in the 10th century, which focused on the remaining coastal areas of Iceland, and the yellow areas in England, which are Wessex, was not settled by Vikings until around the 11th century. The green areas, which are show a lot of raids took place there, but no settlements were done during this period in those areas. Now, as I mentioned, the Vikings were skilled traders. So they founded and formed trading centers and ports for shipping and receiving goods. And this is just one quick sort of potential example of that. The other thing was, and this is very significant for us in some ways, they met in assemblies known as a thing or all thing, which took place at regular intervals, including everyone in the community, and it was presided over by a law speaker. This is a person who was able to memorize and cite from memory all of the customary laws. And so each year he had to cite from memory 1/3 of those laws. The Thing Assembly, and Thing is Thing, Thing assemblies functioned as both a parliament and a court to solve disputes. And they made, political decisions. But it was extremely democratic. Everyone was involved. All the Vikings could be involved in it. And this location in Iceland is well worth you looking at because this is the most dramatic. Being at the chasm where the two tectonic plates exist and are separating. And some of you will see this on one of your tours when we go to Iceland. It's quite amazing, and both Lynn and I really were quite fascinated by the fact it separates a couple centimeters a year. It's not something dramatic, but it's the plates are moving, as we know, tectonic plates move. Let's talk now a little bit about the religion too. The early religions of Angles, Jutes, Saxons, and Goths had Scandinavian origins because the Nordic gods were originally Germanic gods. There was a polytheistic pantheon of gods. The main ones that we hear about are these two. Odin, which is the supreme god of war. In German, he would be Wotan. And Thor, who is the son of Odin. And so we're not going to go into depth on those, but they had their Germanic sort of gods, and there was a polytheistic religion. Celtic missionaries had already arrived in the 7th century in parts of England, but the Norsemen were not converted to Christianity until way, way later. The islands were initially ruled by Norway and Denmark, as was much of Britain at the time. And Orkney and Shetland belonged to the King of Norway until 1469. And it passed into Scottish rule in then 1472, right afterwards. That was when the end of Norse political influence on the British Isles occurred. Now, there's a lot of myths about the Vikings. They were Nordic warriors with horned helmets and wielding axes. Well, this perception is mainly based on the hostile reports of the monk victims of the Viking raids. The Vikings never wore horned hats. Do you have any idea why? Because there's a very practical reason why they wouldn't do it. If you're in a battle with someone, they could grab the horn and pull you down. So they never wore horned hats. So these images and of course Monty Python, it's really quite amazing. But they did not wear that because opponents could grab the horns in battle and pull them to the ground. But they were the greatest adventurers the world had yet seen, and the sheer technical skill of their journeys was a phenomenal achievement. Now, Northumbria in 867 became the northern kingdom of the Vikings. and they established their capital at Yorick, or what is now the town of York. And there's a lot of Viking stuff in York if you go visit it. By 870, this whole area was not known as the Northumbria. It was known as the Danelaw. That's what they called it, the Danelaw. And the Danes probably represented about 20 to 25% of the population in that Danelaw area. Now, the impact of the Viking invasions was to galvanize another kingdom, Wessex. Wessex, which is in the south. And it's an old English kingdom. And it was able to survive the Vikings. The great army of Vikings was checked. Canute was also king of Denmark at the same time he was king of England. He was a Christian, but he didn't force the English to obey Danish law. Instead, he recognized Anglo-Saxon law and customs. He worked to create a North Atlantic empire with united Scandinavia. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 39, very young, and the empire fell apart after his death. This painting illustrates, though, one of the famous stories about King Canute. King Canute went out to try to stop the waves, and that's what he was trying to do. He obviously failed, as you can well imagine. So anyway, as mentioned earlier, Viking raids and settlements have extended to the far northern islands of Orkney and Shetland, and we'll visit them on this cruise in the next 2 days. So let's go back and focus a little bit on this area. The Orkney Islands, group of about 70 islands and inlets, only about which 20 are inhabited. They lie about 20 miles north of the Scottish mainland. And as a result, we're going to visit Kirkwood, which is the capital of the Orkneys. There are plenty of Norse settlements, and a vast majority of the place names in the Orkneys have Norse influence. Can you hear? The Shetlands, there's an archipelago in Scotland lying north of the Orkneys. It's the northernmost region of the United Kingdoms, and Lerwick, which we'll visit, is the capital of the Shetland Islands. Then we get to Iceland, who's the most important piece, and we're going to be there, obviously. And the first settler in Iceland was a Viking. They can't hear. Discovered Iceland. His name was Floki. And he went with the express purpose of establishing a colony there. He had planned to... Great. He had planned to go back to Norway at some point, but the ice blocked the fjord he was at, forced him to stay longer, and he promptly named the island Iceland because of the ice, etc. Now, following his return, interest in migration to Iceland grew tremendously in Norway. And unlike other regions that were colonized by the Vikings, Iceland had no indigenous population whatsoever. So there was no one to conquer, there were no churches, there were no abbeys to sack for portable wealth. So the people who settled the land came initially from Norway, some later came from Orkney and Shetlands and Ireland, and they were led by Norwegian aristocrats of considerable wealth who owned their own ships and could command others to come with them. And so they had a new land where they could farm on a sizable tract of land without being taxed by Norway, which would have been, that made it very attractive to them, to say the least. Anyway, more than 1,500 Scandinavian place names, mainly in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, which were formerly part of the boundary of Danelaw, have names that end in by, B-Y. That's a Norse term for village. So you have Grimsby, Nasby, Whitby, excuse me. And also, if they ended in Thorpe, Thorpe, that means from the family name, and it ends, it ends in Thorpe. And so we have a lot of those Viking names. And, of course, there are some family names that end in son. And, of course, unfortunately, Doug Nelson. I have a name that ends in son, and that also comes, even if it's British or English, it comes from Viking. 60% of the personal names in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire showed Scandinavian influence. So let's talk about some of the legacy that the Vikings left, both in the British Isles, Iceland, and beyond. More than 1,000 Old Norse words were part of the standard English, including several days of the week. They come from Scandinavian Norse languages. These are all English words from Old Norse origins, and you can look at them. There's tremendous number of examples. We have things like landing, score, fellow, take, steersman, again, awkward, birth, cake, fog, law, moss, neck, root, sister, smile, etc., etc. Words that have SK sounds, such as skirt, sky, skin, all from Norse. The word window is really a transliteration of Norse words that meant wind eye. They're expressions to go, to come, to listen, to eat, both, same, get, and give, all Norse words. And personal pronouns are one of the really biggest ones, which was quite a surprise to me. They, them, and their replaced older English forms of personal pronouns. And so we really owe a tremendous debt to the Vikings. This is how English evolved. You can see this chart. In the middle of this chart, Old English evolved from a combination of Old Norse and Danish. Later, it was influenced by Norman French when William the Conqueror conquered the country in 1066. And then a combination of other languages became modern English. And it really is an amalgamation of so many other different languages. But, a good portion, maybe 25% of our words come from a Norse or Viking set of words. We also have some ethnicity issues that would be interesting because, as I said, the Vikings were not just raiders. They actually colonized, they settled, and they intermarried. And so, as a result, we've got some really interesting genes. How many in this audience have English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish descent, ancestors? Look at this. It's almost the whole audience. Well, as a result, you have probably 20% Viking genetic influence in your genes, in your DNA. It's part and parcel of all of our backgrounds if we come from the British Isles, to say the least, or even Iceland, of course. And so the colonization and the merging into the existing settlements, gave that those genes an opportunity to continue with us, so to speak. Now, here's a map of the average ancestry DNA, and the Scandinavian ethnicity estimates across Great Britain and Ireland reveal a strong pattern. The darkest red is where the Danelaw was. And so it's quite obvious that for so many hundreds of years, the Danish ethnicity was very dominant in the peoples of England at that time. And they had an ethnicity of about 13.5%, the chart says. In the Northeast Midlands, we see the average Scandinavian ethnicity of about 11%. Scotland and Wales range from 8% in Wales to 6.5% in southern Scotland. And in average, the average Scandinavian ethnicity varies with a high of 5.3% in Ulster and a low of 2.0% in Munster. So, you've got, the Vikings live on. They live on in us, so to speak. We also have a lot of Viking laws and institutions. A trial of a jury by 12 men really comes out of Viking lore. It's a feature of Danish law. They also introduced silver coins into the population, which never had been used in northern England before the Vikings. So they were really very, very influential in our history. So you look at genetics, you look at language, you look at place names, you look at ideology, and to a little extent, you look at religion. So to summarize, the Vikings had a tremendous influence on all aspects of life that are reflected in Britain today, and even, U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the other British colonies, whether it be genetics, language, place names, or etc. Now, they might not have been the nicest people in the world, but they did shape the British Isles, Iceland, and beyond. And we've learned a lot from them. They did some tremendous success in how they built ships and how they traded, etc. And we've picked up on all of that. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll stop at this point, even though we got cut off a little bit there. With that, I want to thank you. I'll remain in the auditorium for a few minutes afterwards if you have questions. The other thing that I just alert you to, I've done a travel memoir of my 125 countries so far that I've visited, and there's only 2 copies left in the boutique, which if you're one of the 2, I will sign it for you. But the last cruise bought them out, so to speak. It is otherwise available on Amazon if you think it's worth the effort. But it's great fun. The next lecture, I think, will be 2 days from now. We're going to do the Battle of the Atlantic in Great Britain and Iceland. It's the U-boats in World War II, the U-boats and how they impacted the British Royal Navy and the American Navy, etc. And it's a fascinating story. We'll go into a lot more depth in detail, but it's a great story in many ways. So I thank you all very much for coming. Sorry about the interference, obviously.